Hey, what's up, Warrior fam? This is Mr. Saletti. We are about to go over slide set number 5, and the topic of slide set number 5 is slavery in the colonies, part 2. Slide set number 4 was part 1. This is part 2. So here we go. Let's go over this new material. Your key terms and events are on this slide. Of course, with this YouTube video, you can also get the slide set off of Google Classroom. So if I go too fast for you or something, you can always look up the slide on Google Classroom. Of course, you can also always ask me questions by email or in our live class meetings. Okay? So we're going to go over how slavery laws developed in the South, the other parts of America and what was going on there, and 3 important beginnings for anti-slavery movements. So those will be the topics we cover. So first, what we need to talk about, and we talked about slavery growing in the South last time, okay? We talked about how slavery grew because Indian slaves and indentured servants didn't work, and because it was so difficult, you needed so much labor to run a plantation doing staple crop agriculture. So as slavery grows in the South, they have to start creating laws to keep slaves trapped with no way out. And slaves, of course, tried to find ways to get out of it. And at first, some slaves became free because they were baptized. See, there were really no laws about this. And a lot of people said, well, we're taking these people from Africa and they're not Christian, so who cares, right? We can take them to be slaves if they're not Christian. So some slaves figured out, well, what am I going to do? I'm going to get baptized and then I'll be free. And a slave woman named Elizabeth Key, who was of mixed race, okay, her father was a white man, and she sued in court. And she said, look, my father was a white man, and I'm Christian. I got baptized by my father, so you can't keep me as a slave. How can I be a slave if my father was a free white man and a Christian? And she won her case, okay? The court in Virginia set her free. So the government was like, whoa, wait a minute. We don't want this to happen all the time. I mean, what's going to happen? All the slaves are going to run over to church and get baptized, and they're all going to say, I'm free now, right? So they were not going to let that happen. So they started making new laws, this is part down here, to keep those people trapped in slavery. So the first thing they did, they said, if your mother was a slave, you're a slave. And it doesn't matter if your father's white. Because a lot of white men were having sex with slaves, and they were having a lot of mixed children. And they didn't want all those children to be free, so they made a law. So if your father was a white man and he made you with one of his slave women, you were still a slave, okay? If a white woman had a baby with a slave man, that child would have to be an indentured servant until they turned 31 years old. So you were almost a slave. Your whole young life, you would be a slave, and then you would get free. The other thing they did was they banned interracial marriage. Because what was happening was some white men were falling in love with their female slaves, having children with them. And what they would do is they would write a contract setting them free, and then they would marry them. And the reason the states didn't want that, these weren't states at the time, they were colonies, right? This is before the Revolutionary War. They didn't want that because if that happened, there would be a bunch of free mixed race people running around because their mothers were free, even though they were black women. And these guys in the colonial governments didn't want that happening. So they banned interracial marriage. They said, all right, if you're a guy who owns slaves, you can't marry a black woman, a slave, even if you want to. Okay? So, and look, everybody knew this was going on. I mean, even in this old picture, you know, you see the white man, the southern planter, okay, checking out the slave girl. I know it's racy. The slave girl has no top on, and she's serving him. And the whole implication of this is that even though he's this rich white man, like he can do whatever he wants. And, you know, guys, this happened all the time. So they were not going to let people use any of these loopholes to get free. So what was going on in other parts of the country, though? What about New England? You know, when I was saying New England, like, think of the New England Patriots, okay? Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut. Okay, that the northeast part of the country, that's New England, right? Well, slavery was never big in New England. And how could it be? Think about New England, you know, up there in Boston and New Hampshire and Vermont. It's cold. And the soil is rocky. It's not like the South. If you drive through New England, what do you see? A bunch of mountains and valleys and rivers. You don't see like big, gigantic farms because the soil is very rocky and it's cold. You can't grow tobacco up there. You can't grow rice up there. You can't grow indigo up there. So who needs any slaves, right? If you're a white man and you have a farm, but it's a rocky farm, it's small, you're using it to grow food for your family, you don't need slaves. In fact, it would be a waste of money for you to buy slaves. You and your kids and your wife are going to run the farm. A few really rich men had house servants, but slavery never got big in that part of America. It just couldn't because there were no plantations. So over time, courts slowly eliminated slavery by ruling against slave owners. A lot of the time, slaves would sue and they would say, I have the right to be free. And eventually, the Massachusetts Supreme Court actually said slavery cannot happen in Massachusetts. All slaves are free because Massachusetts law said that no one could be a slave and that all men were equal. So eventually, in New England, pretty much slavery didn't exist anymore. We see something like that in the middle colonies. If you don't know the middle colonies, if you didn't learn them in middle school, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, you see why we call them middle? The southern ones are down here. New England is up here. They're in the middle. It's actually really simple. And just like the north, the climate is no good here for plantations. You can't grow those crops in this part of the country. So again, slavery didn't get big. There were small numbers of slaves, but there were never a lot. And over time, they got rid of slavery too. Can't you see in this description how we're moving toward the Civil War? We have a country that's already starting to be divided in half. Okay, the northern part with no slavery, and the southern part needed slavery to run their plantations. So we're already starting to see, this is before the Revolution, okay? The people who are going to be in the Civil War later aren't even alive yet. But we already see the country starting to split into two pieces. Even nearby in the French colonies, and some of these places later would be part of the United States, like Louisiana, parts of the Midwest like Illinois, Ohio, those were French territory at this time. And slavery was legal there, but it wasn't big, okay? France had slavery in places like Haiti where they grew sugar. And you see Haiti is a black country now because there were so many slaves there. But it never got big in North America. Most of the French people in those areas traded with the Indians, okay? So there were no big plantations. So, again, I know I'm repeating now, but just like in New England, just like in the middle colonies, in the French colonies of North America, slavery never got big. So northern slavery, over time, this didn't happen instantly, but over time it faded away. So you can see the answer to this question from what I said in the last couple slides. Slavery was never a big thing anyway in the North. Okay, without staple crop agriculture, which you learned about in your last slide set, so you need to know what I'm talking about, why would you buy slaves? Slaves cost a lot of money. If you don't have a big plantation, you just don't need any. So if there's no slavery anyway, they never made laws that were supposed to keep slaves in check. Again, why would they? There were no slaves there. And most of these states moved kind of slow, but before the Civil War, they all banned slavery. Okay, all the northern states, slavery didn't exist compared to the South and even places like Kentucky where, yes, we had slavery. Okay, here in Kentucky, the only way slavery would go away was later after the North won the war. So that's why slavery faded away. You can give some of the credit for it just to nature, right? If you don't have staple crop agriculture, you don't have plantations, you don't get slavery. Think about it. Okay, slavery lives in warm places where you can have plantations. If you have rocky soil, if you have cold weather, slavery doesn't stick. All right? Anti-slavery movements start springing up, and I'm going to give you 3 examples. You need to know these 3. So I might ask you on a quiz or something to give me these 3 to list them, and you need to be able to do that. The first one I'm going to talk about is slave resistance. So you see the guy in the picture, He's escaping. He's resisting by running away. He's got his sack, with his stuff in it, escaping. Slaves resist through small acts of resistance. I call these small acts, even though symbolically they meant a lot, right? Stealing. You might say, oh, stealing is just stealing. They just wanted stuff. Well, but if you're a slave and you're resisting your master by stealing small things, you can't fight the master. The master has whips and guns and trained attack dogs. Okay. But you can steal some stuff. That's a way of resisting. Breaking tools. Okay. Slaves could slow down their work. You're not working for yourself. Some guy's going to make you work. He says he owns you. Well, why would you bust your ass under those conditions, right? You wouldn't. You would work slowly. Do as little as you can. And of course, running away, like in the picture. Sometimes temporarily, guys would run away, but they knew if they got caught, they would probably be killed. So maybe they would run away from a couple days. Maybe sometimes slaves escaped to see friends and family on other plantations, and then they came back. And they might get beat, but they usually wouldn't be killed because they were worth a lot of money. I told you in another slide set, the price of slaves was roughly equivalent to the price of a car today. So that's a lot of money. Now, not always. Some whites killed slaves. That definitely happened. But a lot of times they would give them a small punishment because they wanted them to keep them and so they could keep working. The second one is slave revolts, and this is much more serious. Sometimes slaves would rise up and fight and resist their captivity with violence. Okay, and I'm just going to give you one example here. There will be more later in the class. The Stono Rebellion was one of the very early famous ones. See, before the Revolutionary War, 1739 in South Carolina. So what happened was there was a slave named Jemmy, and he led an uprising of a bunch of slaves, and from the records we see, most of these slaves were from Africa. Like, they weren't slaves who lived in America for years. These were new slaves, some of whom probably didn't even speak English. They were from the Congo. And Jemmy led them in a revolt. And Jemmy, one of the things about Jemmy was that he knew how to read. His master had taught him to read. So they got weapons, knives, axes, just like in the picture, and they started killing. Okay, and they killed 25 whites. They were trying to escape to Florida. Florida at that time was a Spanish colony, and if they could escape there, they had a chance to be free. But the South Carolina militia got together and killed all of them. So all the guys in the Stono Rebellion died. And I say that in an interesting way. Sometimes there are things worth fighting and dying for, right? These guys were fighting because they were being told that they were less than human, that they were just somebody's property. And yes, it sucks that they got caught and they got killed, but also we can admire their bravery and the fact that they were willing to give up everything in order to fight for their freedom. The long-term result of this, of course, the rebels were all dead. Jemmy was dead. But South Carolina banned teaching blacks to read because of this. They were afraid that if blacks could read books, they might read books about how there should be equality and stuff, and then they would fight. Also, they stopped slaves from moving around between plantations. You had to have a pass from your master if you wanted to leave your plantation, because they were afraid that this is how slaves were sneaking around planning their rebellion. And the last one is Quakers. Now, this is goofy, I know, but I'll explain. Quakers were the first major group of white people to turn against slavery. And Quakers are a Christian group. Okay, you might recognize the dude here from the Quaker Oats. Back at that time, Quakers a lot of times wore the black suit, right, with the little kerchief, the white kerchief. And it's famous now because we put it on an oatmeal package. And they were called that because they felt the Holy Spirit, like when they would have their services. Some of you go to church, probably you see those grannies and stuff in church who start shaking. I feel the Spirit, right? Well, Quakers did that. They would shake and wiggle around and fall down and, get all spiritual. So they were quaking. So people called them Quakers. They didn't give themselves that name. That's what other people called them. Okay, we still have Quakers today. These people down here are Quakers. I actually saw this picture. This was from Illinois. So these are modern Quakers today. So they don't dress funny anymore. They dress pretty much normal, but they're still a Christian group. One of our presidents was a Quaker, Richard Nixon, who actually kind of a terrible president who had to resign because he was corrupt. But he was our only Quaker president. So that's not a great example for them, I guess. Quaker ministers started to teach, no, wait a minute. And again, I'm going to sound all religified here, but I'm trying to tell you what Quakers said. Okay? If all people are one in Christ, and that's what the Bible says, right? And that's what Christians say, then how can one person own another person? That's a sin. I mean, if you're basing it on the Bible, there's arguments in there because the Old Testament maybe says slaves, some people were slaves, and the New Testament says no, so it's back and forth, and we're not going to get into that, but that's what the Quakers started to say. How can you own another man and call yourself a Christian? He's your equal. He's your equal in Jesus. So how can you do that? That's so wrong. Quakers started to point this out. And they're a small group. There's not a lot of Quakers. It's not a big religion. It's not like Catholic or Baptist or something. It's very small. But they planted a seed that would grow later. They were the first white people to start saying, wait a minute, what are we doing? And that's going to grow and grow and grow. And later, it's going to be really important. Okay, even when we get to the civil rights movement, you'll see Martin Luther King reaching out to white people, reaching out to white ministers, white churches, okay, white synagogues, because he knew, we need more people to push this movement for freedom and equality. So Quakers were an important beginning to the whole thing. All right? So that's the end of this set of slides. Again, feel free to ask me any questions. Come to our live class meetings, send me an email, whatever you need to do. Okay? Thanks, guys.